Greetings. Thank you all for tuning in for another video. Just that you're glad to see me as I'm glad to see you. So it's been quite some time since I've done a proper book review, and so I'm very excited to talk about the book which is the subject of this podcast or this video, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin. So to begin, let's go ahead and give some context. Most of you are probably familiar with Lenin, who he was, the first leader of the Soviet Union, in addition to that being an intellectual and a prolific writer and thinker on communist theory. So Lenin wrote this book in the midst of World War I. I believe he published it in 1916 or so. And he took as his subject the political and economic state of the world, of the globe. And he was not only concerned with contemporary affairs, he was concerned with looking backwards, that is, at the past several decades, in the past century, in the sort of political and economic trends that had led up into that point. And so it's important to note that from Lenin's point of view, the world seemed to be dominated by a handful of powerful industrial capitalist nations that had essentially carved up the world amongst themselves. They had engaged in aggressive policies of territorial expansion, otherwise known as imperialism or colonialism, right? And so there is very clearly this stark divide between nations like Great Britain, the United States, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, list goes on and on and on. These Western European countries, as well as the United States, who are industrialized, who cement their political dominance and power through having a strong economy, right? And in turn, a nation like Great Britain, for example, which is territorially smaller and has a far smaller population, somehow manages to subdue the entire sub-Indian continent. How exactly does that happen? Well, the answer is rather simple. We tend to put economics and politics into two separate containers. But make no mistake, they are very intimately related to one another, right? And so it's very obvious that the Industrial Revolution brought about many great things like the proliferation of goods. Countries were able to produce more goods that could then be used to engage in foreign trade and raise people's living standards of at least the people living in the nations that produced them. And in addition to that, it led to technological superiority, right? And so these nations, these industrial nations, were competing at a level that was, with respect to the entirety of human history, unprecedented. Now, Lenin seems to jump to the conclusion that this means that capitalism is by its very nature imperialistic, that it tends towards the creation of imperialism. And this is a point that I disagree with Lenin on very simple grounds. My counter argument is this. Imperialism antedates capitalism, especially industrial capitalism. So if we look at the ancient world, we see that there are many notable civilizations which at some point in their history were empires, whether it's the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire or the Greeks, the Macedonians, the Mongols, the Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, list goes on and on and on. This policy of territorial expansion in order to bolster one's economic or political dominance is not anything that is new or unique to the modern world, let alone capitalism or industrial capitalism. Nevertheless, Lenin seems to believe quite emphatically, he seems to stress that it is precisely capitalism that has led to this result. Now, it's intimately related to one of the biggest claims that he makes in this book, one of the first claims that he makes, which is that capitalism also leads to the creation of monopolies or monopolistic firms. So the logic that he employs here is that, okay, the early stages or early history of capitalism begins with free market, laissez-faire economics, right? So you have individuals engaging in economic activity by their own volition, right? And so you have firms freely competing against one another in order to maximize shareholder value, right? That's why a firm exists. A firm exists to maximize shareholder value. And so they're trying to compete against one another to maximize profit, essentially. And so the forces of supply and demand combine in order to create economic harmony. Well, Lenin believes that this process, competition or free competition, leads to a level of competition that becomes gradually and gradually more vicious until certain firms begin to outcompete other firms into extinction. And the firms that survive are rewarded with not only more profit, not only more capital, but greater and greater share and control of particular markets and industries. And now, while it is a matter of fact that in the course of the Industrial Revolution, we see the emergence of these big, gigantic, national, even multinational corporations and firms in industries like steel, railroad, oil. I do disagree with Lenin on this point of free market competition leading to the creation of monopolies. I believe, on the contrary, that it is actually governments that enable the creation of monopolies. And this is a point of view which I adopted when I read Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, one that I don't have enough time to delve into in this video, but perhaps I can expound on that later at another time. But basically, the point that Lenin seeks to make is that capitalism is not only by its very nature imperialistic, but it also leads to the creation of monopolies. Now, the question we have to ask is, why is that a bad thing? Like, why is it bad for monopolies to exist? Well, let's go ahead and use a contemporary example. There are really many reasons, but if you look at the South Korean economy today, South Korea's economy is capitalist, okay? South Korea's economy is heavily dependent on a handful of companies called chobols. Okay, so some of these companies you're likely familiar with, like Samsung and LG, these electronic companies, they make like cell phones, TVs, and other kinds of electronics and stuff. These companies combined, these chobols combined, these biggest companies in South Korea account for like upwards of 50% of the South Korean economy's GDP. What this implies is that these businesses are too big to fail. Like, if they fail, everyone fails. We saw a similar situation in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis in the United States. The very same Wall Street firms which were responsible for engaging in reckless financial behavior, reckless actions that led to the housing market collapse, those very same firms were inevitably bailed out by the government because, again, they were too big to fail, right? And so the reason this is bad is very obvious. Like, it's a precarious position for the masses, for people, for the entirety of a society's livelihood and well-being to depend so heavily on only a fraction, a minority of companies or firms possessing a fraction of the country's wealth, right? And so this is one of the reasons why it's a bad thing. But aside from that, a monopoly has a lot of leverage and a lot of influence to control society and politics, perhaps not directly, but indirectly at the very least. All right. So moving on, another one of the major points that Lenin makes is he talks about banking. All right. And so a lot of people, including myself, sort of underestimate the extent to which our modern economic systems depend heavily on credit to be stimulated. And they depend on the issue of credit in order to stimulate economic activity. So to put this very simply, banks serve two roles primarily: to hold deposits, that's one, and to lend out money at interest, that's two. That's how they make their money. They lend out money at interest. Now, a side note is our modern banking system employs a type of banking called fractional reserve banking, which means that they can actually loan out more money than they have in deposits. And this is bad for a lot of obvious reasons, but it's a bit unrelated to the topic at hand. The point that I wish to make is Lenin noted that a similar process happens or was happening in the banking or finance sectors around the world. Basically, the same phenomenon that was occurring in these industrial markets where you have a handful of companies which absorb more and more of the market and they become monopolistic in nature. You see the same phenomenon in the banking industry, the finance industry. And so the example that he uses, he puts out a figure, a statistic that shows that in Berlin, I believe it was in the early 20th century. It was either early 20th century or late 19th century one. In Berlin, he noted this trend where only about 9 banks in the entire country, a very small fraction of banks, held upwards of 50% of total deposits in the German economy. Now, this implies that only a handful of banks control that amount of wealth, that they have that amount of the country's money supply at hand. That money in turn is then going to be lended to an industrialist. And so we often think that the employee is the servant of the industrialist who employs him, right? This is the classic distinction that Marx makes between the bourgeoisie and the proletarian, But what people fail to notice is that the industrialist is also the servant of the bank who loans him money in order to engage in industry. You see, because this is what we fail to realize. Oftentimes, in order to finance an industrial enterprise, there has to be someone to actually come up with the money. That's where banks come in. That's the role that they play. But instead of being modest intermediaries, they become these big, gigantic titans, financial titans, where they're able to indirectly control and influence entire markets and industries through the sometimes discriminate issue of credit, right? And so to give you an idea of how important the issue of credit is in our economy, I'll cite a contemporary example, one which you should all likely remember, should be fresh on your mind. Several years ago, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government issued stimulus checks, to a lot of people. And so why did they do that? It's in the name, to stimulate the economy. One of the variables of GDP, which GDP is how we measure economic activity, one of the metrics, how we measure economic activity, one of the variables of GDP is consumer spending. Consumer spending accounts for upwards of 2/3 of GDP. And so in order to stimulate consumer spending, they basically injected the economy with money. They gave people free money. By the way, it was not free. And that in turn helped avert a more severe economic downturn. Okay. And so this is just a single example of how the issue of credit stimulates economic activity. Now, a capitalist is someone who by definition employs capital, right? In order to employ capital, they have to be able to afford it. And that's where the point about banks comes in. Essentially, what Lenin points out is that the banks are at the top of the economic pyramid, okay? So the last point I'll mention, and then I'll go ahead and conclude this video, is Lenin pointed out something else which I think is incredibly notable. He notes that there's the stark divide, as I previously said, there's a stark divide between the industrial nations like Great Britain, United States, Germany, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, yada, yada, yada. These industrial nations on the one hand, and then these non-industrial nations on the other hand, the ones with the underdeveloped economies, right? Now, it still holds true today. Poorer nations want to develop their economies. They want to raise the standard of living for their people. They want more infrastructure. They want more jobs. They want more industry. They want higher wages. They want all the benefits that industrialization confers. But the problem is you need to have someone willing to invest. Who is going to be the intermediary? All right. Like, who is going to finance enterprise? Who's going to finance or invest in your economy? The industrial nations, which were once, colonizers of many of these poorer nations, they end up, the nations which were once colonies end up winning their political independence, but they don't win their economic independence because they end up depending on the finance capital of the industrial nations. And this is the point. Everything that I've said up until this point is what Lenin really is trying to get at. He's saying that finance capital is the highest stage of capitalist imperialism. Like, the way to control people is through money, through the issue of money, the extension of credit and debt. Because when they issue these loans, when many of these countries would approach, say, a poor country like, or at the time, a poor country like Argentina, they would stipulate that in exchange for giving you this money to invest in your economy, we want to have control of this port, or we want you to spend XYZ amount of dollars on defense, And so basically there's always some strings attached. There's a strategic advantage at play. And this plays into the fact that globally speaking, all of these nations want to compete. They want to maintain a competitive edge against one another. You see, because the thing is like, if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it, and they're going to usurp your position in the global geopolitical hierarchy. Now, a contemporary example of this can be seen in Africa today. The CCP, that is the Chinese government, has been investing heavily in many poor, underdeveloped African countries. Now, do you think that they're doing this out of benevolence? Do you think they're doing it out of charity because they want to raise the living standard of all these poor African countries? It's like, no. I mean, it's like, that may be like on the surface, that's their pretense, but it's strategic. It's about control. It's about being able to exploit some sort of advantage that is going to propel them to the status of number one world superpower ahead of the United States, And so that's just a single contemporary example that I have off the top of my head. But anyway, I certainly did not get into like any and every point worth mentioning in this book. I really just wanted to talk about the ones that I've included in this video, this podcast, because they were the ones that stood out the most to me. Like I've said in the past, I'm not a communist, I'm not a Leninist, I'm not a Marxist or anything of the sort. I am opposed to I'm opposed to communism, I believe that free market economics is the finest form of economic organization to which mankind can aspire. That being said, I think that oftentimes we get so absorbed in this debate between capitalism versus communism that we miss out on some essential points and insights, which rather surprisingly, someone as unsuspecting as Lenin, at least I did not suspect Lenin to endorse such a view. Someone like Lenin is actually drawing our attention to this. But of course, the reason I say this is because if you start from the standpoint that Lenin has nothing of value to say, then you never get around to hearing what he has to say. And so all that is to say, don't censor someone before you have given ear to what they're saying. Don't readily accept something at face value, but don't dismiss it so readily either, right? At the end of the day, I don't necessarily agree with many of the premises and conclusions contained within this book. However, I think there are many valuable insights. When I look at the contemporary state of the world and our economy and our way of life, I see that the most notable feature or characteristic of our economy is debt. Like, it's saturated with debt, and I don't think that's by coincidence. I see the way that debt controls people, it limits and constrains people, and it leads certain entities and parties to maintain dominance over others. I've talked about this in a prior video. It applies to individuals as much as it does to nations and countries. And in order to understand the way the world really works, I think it's important to put two and two together, not to just trust, what the media is telling us. Because let's be fair, man. Like, did you ever learn about this in school? Did you ever learn about this watching CNN or Fox News? Like, no, they don't talk about these things. These are very important ideas which don't get in the limelight because, it's not simply because it's true. I don't think that people are trying to deliberately conceal the truth. I think that people are simply being misled and misguided to direct their attention towards the wrong things. And so they're concealing the truth indirectly, if that makes any sense. Anyway, I've gone off on a tangent. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you didn't, dislike it. If you liked it, like it. If you think somebody else would be interested in it, please share. If you have any comments, critiques, questions, etc., as always, leave those down in the comment section below. I love hearing from you guys. I'm very eager to know what your feedback is. If any of you have read this book, highly encourage reading it if you're interested in history, politics, economics, or philosophy. And I guess until next time, bye-bye.